Carl Jung spent most of his life being misread. Colleagues called him a mystic when he talked about the unconscious as something more than repressed sexuality. The public, when they thought of him at all, thought of a strange old man in Switzerland who took dreams too seriously. He rarely tried to correct that impression. He let his work speak slowly, over decades, to the people who were paying close enough attention to hear it. Near the very end of his life, that changed. A year and a half before he died, Carl Jung sat for one BBC interview, the only filmed record of his voice we have. Then, in the final year of his life, he wrote the last chapter he would ever write, the opening essay of a book called Man and His Symbols, finished just 10 days before the illness that killed him. Between those two things, the interview and that final chapter, he left 4 lessons. Not warnings, not riddles, 4 things he apparently thought were worth saying with the time he had left. If you've spent your life feeling things you can't quite explain to people who haven't felt them too, these are for you. Stay for the 4th. It's the one thing he was still correcting on paper 10 days before he died, and it's not what you'd expect from a man who spent 60 years studying the mind. There's a reason these 4 lessons land differently if you're a deep intuitive, an INFJ, INTJ, INFP, or INTP. You already live closer to the layer Jung spent his life defending. The dreams, the sudden knowing, the sense that something means more than it appears to. Most of the world around you was never taught to trust that layer. Jung spent his last breath, almost literally, trying to convince them it was worth trusting. He was making the case for the part of the mind you already live in. Let's start with the first lesson. Lesson 1. Stop needing to believe. Start letting yourself know. Source: the BBC interview, 1959. The interviewer asked Jung gently if he believed in God. Jung paused for a long time, long enough that you can still feel it in the footage today. Then he said, "It's difficult to answer. I know. I don't need to believe. I know." People took that as arrogance. It wasn't. After 60 years of sitting across from people in their worst pain, watching what moved through their dreams and their breakdowns, Jung had lived certain things directly enough that belief simply became the wrong word for it. He had proof of this kind of knowing in his own practice long before that interview. Once, while a patient described a dream about a golden scarab beetle, Jung heard a tapping at the window behind him. He turned, opened it, and a real beetle flew into the room, the closest thing Switzerland has to a golden scarab. He didn't call it luck. He called it a glimpse of something operating underneath the world that reason alone can't account for. He'd later give this pattern a name: synchronicity, a meaningful coincidence with no causal link. That's the kind of evidence I know was built on, not a feeling he decided to trust. A pattern he watched repeat for decades until arguing about it started to feel beside the point. You know this feeling. You've had a certainty you couldn't defend in an argument because it didn't arrive through argument. It arrived through living something. The lesson isn't trust every gut feeling. It's this: don't let the fact that you can't prove something to someone else convince you that you don't actually know it. Lesson 2. A life without meaning is not a life you can survive. It's a life you'll fight, quietly, forever. Source: the same BBC interview. In passing, almost as an aside, Jung said, "Man cannot stand a meaningless life. Not prefers meaning, cannot stand its absence." He wasn't theorizing. Decades earlier, in 1913, Jung broke with Sigmund Freud, the mentor and father figure who had built his entire career. He lost his professional circle. Colleagues called him a mystic. He resigned his university post and, by his own account, came close to a full psychological collapse. For years he sat with visions and voices he couldn't fully explain, recording them in a private journal he was too afraid to publish in his lifetime. He didn't survive that collapse, by finding comfort. He survived it by finding meaning inside it, treating the crisis itself as material worth understanding rather than a wound to medicate away. Everything he became known for afterward, the shadow, the collective unconscious, individuation, came out of that period. He didn't just say meaning was necessary, he tested the claim on himself at the edge of his own sanity, and it held. This is the sentence that explains the ache you feel on an ordinary Tuesday when nothing is technically wrong. Your job is fine, your health is fine, and still, something in you is quietly protesting. Jung would say that protest isn't a malfunction. It's the most honest part of you, refusing to accept a life that runs on schedule but means nothing. You were never built to tolerate that. Nobody is. Lesson 3. The part of you that dreams is not noise. It is trying to reach you. Source: Man and His Symbols. The chapter Jung was still finishing 10 days before his final illness. Jung's argument, the one he spent his last year defending, was that modern life trains you to trust only the rational, provable part of your mind and to ignore everything underneath it. But that deeper part doesn't go quiet just because you stopped listening. It keeps sending messages every night in the only language it has: symbol, image, dream. Not because your brain is doing maintenance while you sleep, because something in you is still trying to tell you something the daylight version of you keeps refusing to hear. In that same chapter, Jung pointed out something almost unsettling. Even a mind that considers itself entirely rational is still surrounded by symbols it responds to without thinking. A flag, a logo, an image that carries more weight than its literal shape should allow. His point wasn't that symbols are primitive superstition, it's that the symbol-making part of you never left. It just moved underground, into your dreams and your sudden, unexplainable reactions, because you stopped giving it anywhere else to live. If you've always sensed that your dreams, your sudden intuitions, the things that surface in you unbidden, mean something, Jung's last work was built entirely to defend that instinct. Not to interpret every dream like a fortune cookie, but to take seriously that a recurring image, a repeated feeling on waking, is information, not static. Lesson 4. You don't become whole by winning the war inside you. You become whole by ending it. Source: Man and His Symbols. The same final chapter. This was the argument underneath all the others. Not that the rational mind is wrong and the unconscious is right. Jung wasn't interested in you choosing a side. He believed the exhaustion so many people carry comes from being permanently split, the reasonable self on one side, the deep self on the other, at war for control. He had a word for what happens when that war ends: individuation, not self-improvement, becoming, finally, undivided. It doesn't happen as one dramatic reconciliation. It happens the way most of Jung's own insight happened, in small moments where you stop overriding what you sense in favor of what you can justify and start letting both inform each other instead. The scarab at the window, the visions he refused to dismiss after Freud, the dream you keep having but haven't sat with. Each of the first 3 lessons was, in its own way, a rehearsal for this 4th one. He never lived to see the book published. He finished his part, approved his colleagues' drafts, and died that June. Von Franz, the colleague closest to him, finished the conclusion he didn't live to write. Look at the 4 lessons together, and they're really one lesson, told 4 times. Know without needing permission to know. Refuse a life that runs on schedule but means nothing. Listen to what surfaces in you unbidden instead of arguing it away, and stop treating your rational self and your deep self as rivals for the same throne. A man who spent 60 years studying other people's minds spent his last year turning the same instrument on himself. And what he found wasn't peace exactly, it was integration. That was apparently worth the last 10 days he had. What he left behind wasn't a farewell, It was 4 lessons aimed at exactly the kind of mind that's still watching, still listening, long after everyone else changed the channel. If that's you, subscribe. There's more of this waiting for you, and tell me in the comments, which of these 4 lessons landed the hardest for you?